I entirely agree with you on where intersectionality has to work and where the critique has to come. And I find, in order to be more radical and more questioning the queer politics, I'm not just passing this burden on to the queer movement, or it's like identifying myself with the queer movement. But I feel now it is necessary for the queer movement and the politics to radically question marriage and family as institutions. And for me, that is where a lot of things, I mean, it's that those two institutions have not been sufficiently questioned and sufficiently challenged, and that's where the problems lie. So, and the second question is about asexuality in India as a movement and as a community. It's entirely invisible, and how do we bring in? And it's if they can find voice somewhere, it's only with the queer people. It's never, though the sexuality itself is questioned there, and we haven't gone into the questions of sexuality yet. This is something that is taken for granted, and it's like, and then the entire movement is built around it as if this is something there that is with us for in all our adult lives. Right. And asexuality as a movement, as an orientation, questions it. How are we going to bring this into India and make it visible?
Marriage. So I hope you will answer this as well, right? Because we've had too many fights about this for you to get off this lightly. So marriage is complicated, So I have a very easy feminist critique of marriage. So I personally am very resolved about it. I don't want it. I'm happy without it. I have a clear institutional critique of it. So if the gay movement goes marriage heavy, I would step aside, and and I think that there is one part of queer politics, because it comes so strongly from feminism, has always had this critique, right? And it always has done so. But I think that the complication is this. I think the complication is, and I've struggled with this because I know a range of married people who live very queer lives. Right? And what do I mean? And straight, gay, technically, whatever, that whole round of it. But because I think the question really comes back to is, when you critique an institution, how do you do so? You can reject it. The question is, can you critique it from within? Can you undo it from within? Can you embody it so differently that it loses its meaning? Now, on marriage, I would tend to say no. The problem is that in IHS, I work on housing, and I work with municipalities. And all my friends in the housing rights movement say, you can't fix them from within. The state will, as an institute, the critique of marriage, critique of state, they follow very parallel theoretical trajectories. So I find myself constantly defending my choice to work within the state, to try and not undo it, but to lessen its footprint, right? And working closely within that system has really challenged my own personal things on marriage, because as have the experiences of people around me on what it means to live and work in very different kind of marriages. So I know where I am, but I have to say that I have a really hard time drawing neat lines on this the way I used to. I used to have a very clear position on marriage, I think it's for the better that it has gotten more difficult for me. So what I'm trying to think through now is to keep a critique of the linking of marriage to the institution of the state, and to its primacy as the only legitimate way to live a life. That I'm solidly behind, right? So when IHS made a leave policy, we all went to fight and said maternity and paternity, the words maternity, so I'm very proud of our leave policy, because the words maternity and paternity don't appear. Right? We say primary and secondary caregiver. And primary and secondary caregiver are completely independent of kinship and marriage, which means it can be you and your neighbor, or you and me, in case you would like to raise a child with me. And you can be you and me. It can be, any, and the principal objection there was not, oh, we need to include queer people. It was marital status cannot be in any way determined to my right to leave for my caretaking for my child. And whether it's biological or adopted, and we fought for that, and we established it here. And that, to me, is my politics around marriage. That if marriage to you symbolizes something of value, feel free. But it cannot be the way the state recognizes rights. Now, the counter argument, of course, is that as long as the state recognizes it, we're fooling ourselves to think that the social thing. And so I can critique and counter critique this in my head like a ping pong table. So I see where you're coming from. I'm just, and I'm pushing back only to say that I think the productive thing to do for me is to try and see what it means to construct new kinds of relationships that give support and intimacy that can take other forms, right? So I have a notion of family. I have a notion of growing old. I have a commitment to a certain set of friends that I will grow old with. None of them are my romantic partners who are separate, from that. And the 4 or 5 of us think of ourselves as a queer family. We can't say that because one of them hates the word family, so she doesn't use it. So we call ourselves whatever. But we have a certain set of commitments we made to each other. And they involve all of those things. Sharing money, growing old, and saying that regardless of who we are, quote unquote, romantically involved with, our friendships are equivalent to our romantic relationship. That to me is my critique of marriage. It's living a life in which it's not just the institution of marriage, but it's the idea that romance or that kind of love is primary to friendship. And I don't agree with that. And I think that's a very queer, that comes from queer politics. To think of friendship as one of the highest forms of love is a way of imagining a different way to embody queer politics and sexuality. And asexuality comes from that because asexuality in some senses values affection and intimacy and separates it necessarily from physical desire. And I think that's a really important move. I mean, I have actually just begun to take seriously what asexuality means. Personally, it's a very personal thing. When we were doing this, it was totally off our radar. And because we were so we just did, all we wanted to do was desire. So the idea of pulling back at that point, it was beyond us. But I think that's that. I think that I have I know Mario and I have debated and disagreed and thought about marriage for a very long time. And every time someone in our friend circle has gotten married, there has been this moment where everyone has taken stock. And I think the one convincing, when one of my closest friends in the world got married, what she said is, I don't believe this is the only option. I don't believe this is superior. I don't believe that this is et cetera, and I will recognize and fight the recognition from the state, but I will do it within this structure. And I think that's a completely valid political location to hold. It's not mine. But
can I interrupt there?
Sure.
There's a danger in endorsing it. I mean, that is what
Sure.
I'm pointing out. It's the more and more we endorse it as a political movement, and more we are into it. We can't, just escape it if the idea is to get out of it.
You're right. Absolutely. And every political position we take will.
I think the reason why we take the opinion you're putting forward seriously is because look at all these issues we're talking about, right? These 2 women committing suicide. What is it around? It's around the issue that they're being pressurized into marriage. It's around the issue that the families are rejecting them. So family and marriage have always been seen in a certain way. And you're right, it does communicate a very different perspective.
Absolutely.
And I think the challenge is, how do you visibilize this violence and take it seriously? And that's the big challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the point is, I'm not too sure in terms of, as Gautam was saying, is the way forward in terms of rejecting the institution, or is it in terms of critiquing the institution? How do you relate to that particular institution? Because we also have the case of, we have the case of families of LGBT persons where we've been very supportive, of their children. And in terms of the 377 case, what we saw at the Supreme Court level is we had this petition by 19 parents of LGBT persons. And they were making the point that, as far as we're concerned, we know the law better than anybody else because it impacts our families and our children most intimately. So we have a critique of this particular law because we come from the position of love as far as our children are concerned. I think there's these kind of families as well, as are those kind of families. So how do you take a position in the middle of these kind of very conflicting ways in which the family actually works? Is really
but I'd say that the one thing that I think anyone across queer circles is, here is my assumption again, in the queer politics I understand, is that even the people I know who get married have a very vocal critique of marriage. Like its dominance across sexuality, its compulsarity, I think marriage is India's most violent institution without any exception. Without any question for anybody. And it's and that is something that I think you're totally right, that the queer movement should really, as opposed to individual identity, take that as a structural argument that will again help us build a certain set of alliances that that in many places are in place, but I think could really be much more vocal on that, on a sort of cross-intersectional shared critique of marriage in the form that it exists today in India, all the theoretical possibilities aside, is absolutely should be more central and should be more vocal. And I mean, on that, I think, regardless of our varying positions on marriage personally, like you put up on what it is in India today, it's basically a license to legitimate violence and murder. I mean, that's all it is to me, quite frankly.
Yeah, so you spoke about like what voice, because you said that, you know, if you had a voice, then what would you do with it? And you also spoke about intersectional politics. Now I want to know, like, what do you think about representation, like the importance of representation in politics in India today? Because we have like, so the main like point of a political party is representation, right? So we in religion you have the Shiv Sena, for region and language you have the DMK, and you have various political parties like that. Do you think that representation as an LGBT party, because you know in the EU there are loads of political parties for that take the stance on LGBT politics, and they think representation and you know in the government is really important, and the fact that you know laws need to be changed and stuff like that. So do you think representation could be a solution?
You mean political representation?
Political representation, like in form of parties that are made for the LGBT movement. Not only take LGBT as like a stance or have you know and have a notion on LGBT, but actually made for the LGBT movement.
Yeah, I think the only way to answer that is to say that we have many identities and many ways of being. And at one level, we might be gay or lesbian, but we also happen to be upper caste or lower caste. We also happen to have Muslim or Hindu range, and we also happen to have a range of political and ideological positions. And clearly, I don't see the way forward today in India as being an LGBT party, because we'll run into precisely the same problems Gautam has highlighted, right? You'll have people within your party who say that Modi is the best thing to happen in this country. And we'll be like absolutely clear that that cannot be the way forward. So I don't think the way forward can be an LGBT party. It has to be a party which takes on board LGBT concerns, but as a wider perspective, really. For example, today I think at least the way I see it, and I think both of you guys will agree, that the clear challenge facing India in the next coming 1 year is the 2014 elections. Yeah. I mean, if that man comes to power, you can kiss the rest of any kind of politics goodbye. It's the most important challenge. And you'll be, of course, you know, that many LGBT people will not realize or will not think that it's the most important challenge. Yeah. They'll think that, you know, I mean, how does it matter? I mean, Modi is great. I mean, he's fantastic. What's the problem? But then you have to have I don't think you can have a narrow lens on politics anymore. Yeah. In fact, the one thing I think a post-377 move can only be that your politics has to encompass a range of issues. It just has to. And one concrete illustration of that might be, if you're asking what might one future direction be, it would be around the entire issue of a non-discrimination law, which takes seriously the discrimination faced in the private sector by people with disability, by people who on grounds of caste, on grounds of religion, as well as on grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. Yeah. And the concrete illustration is that you can't have a law. You can't advocate for a law for non-discrimination grounds in gender identity and sexual orientation. You won't get on. Yeah. The only way you can do that is by taking on board a range of issues. Yeah. Taking on board a range of issues, you have taken on board in a way in which you have to take on board people who believe in that kind of politics. So you have to move from questions of identity to maybe questions of ideology or belief, or what do we choose to call it. So.
You said, also giving us the sort of disclaimer that of course you're an academic, but it's the context, right? To be able to see, and you wrote this book in 2005, right? Okay, so if we, this is just a personal opinion, if we say that 2009, with the 377 verdict and all of that, is India's equivalent of the Stonewall riots for, so that was what? 4 years ago, right? And if you look at history, between Stonewall and now, there's been a good 44 years. And you see where America is at the moment, and they're talking about marriage equality and you know, which number of states. I find it fascinating, also slightly disturbing on some levels, that maybe the queer youth of today, like you said, without totally understanding, maybe not totally understanding the context of it, will also fight, say, for, say, a marriage equality within India. And I'm not quite sure whether we've done that whole gamut of growth yet as a queer movement. But since you guys have seen this from a sort of more of an overarching sort of perspective for a longer period of time and seen the different, I don't know, milestones, for the lack of a better term, that we've hit, what do you think the growth is? And if we were, I don't know, maybe it's because I read a lot, and so I see, it's interesting for me. I was a history student as well, so I like seeing things from a sort of like a bird's eye perspective. So it's great to see the movement, say, in America from Stonewall to now, to see how far they've moved. Yeah. But if you were to compare it, because there is a lot of comparison that happens, where would you see we've reached?
I mean, I think there's a bit of danger in teleology, in these narratives that move from low to high, from early to late, from pre-modern to modern, and it's Hasina and Fatima. The question is, Hasina and Fatima in that narrative cannot exist, because you cannot move forward to Hasina and Fatima. Because Hasina and Fatima doesn't look like progress. It doesn't look like identity-based modernity. It doesn't look like gay bars on the street. It doesn't look like the Castro. And I think that's what actually is encouraging for me, is that I don't see this as a historical trend. I lived for many years in the States, going back and forth between school, and I actually find queer life in the state fairly terrifying in many ways, and not because there is a certain, it's weird. There are places I remember once when the judgment happened, and someone called me and said, from an American newspaper, and she said, what's it like to be gay in India? I said, well, what's it like to be gay in America? And she said, it's great. I said, where do you live? She said, San Francisco. I said, have you ever been to Wyoming? And it was a Dutix question. I said, ask me what it's like to be an upper-class gay man in Delhi. That I can tell you. I mean, it's one of these broad kind of stroke kind of questions where America is not just Stonewall. So America actually is the 13th to the 25th century at the same time, just like India is. This country is radically progressive and utterly orthodox, if those words have any meaning, at the same time. I think, that's the kind of, these are simultaneous timescapes. And whether or not so the question to me that's exciting is, it's not a question of, are we going to catch up? The question is, where the hell does one go? And there is and I'm not convinced that post-Stonewall reality. So I'll give you an example of Philadelphia when I was around that area. 2 candidates ran for mayor, right? And one was black and one was white. And one of them had, actually that wasn't relevant, but I think it was one was black, one was white. And one of them had a very strong position on gay marriage, okay? And a large number of the mainstream LGBT groups, Human Rights Campaign, etc., all endorsed this guy because this is your political representation question, right? Here's a candidate who says, I will support gay marriage. And a whole set of secondary queer organizations, largely organizations of color. Of course, the Human Rights Campaign does not think of itself as a white gay organization, it just is de facto, right? Sorry, that's a little personal opinion, but anyway, we used to call it the Human Rights Champagne Fund for a long time. So, and it's one of those, and they endorsed the other candidate who had he didn't have a negative stance, but he didn't take a stand for equality. He was like, rights, violence, don't get beaten, don't get jailed, very good. But I'm not going to go out on a limb for you. And there was this whole tension on saying, why is the community not standing together? That's the classic question. Why aren't you endorsing the political representation who has the stand on gay rights? He said, that guy has a better stand on Medicaid, public housing, and welfare. And Medicaid, public housing, and welfare are queer issues. Because a third of homeless teenagers in America are on the street because they're gay. Right? And it's one of those things where, so it's like, there is a certain narrative of Stonewall history in the US, which is a deeply racialized and exclusive history of queer politics in that country. And to me, it's not queer politics, it is LGBT politics. It's exactly why, in that point, it's a story you wanted to, in some sense, move away from. And I don't mean to sort of demonize America as a place, there is also a lot of movement. So I think that for me, so the only way to answer for me your question is, I think that multiple timescapes are here, and we have to figure out our ways of thinking about sexuality. We have to figure out our ways of, and there is no one way that India will also find, right? In our own multiple contexts. And there will be those of us who will reject marriage. There will be those of us who will embrace asexuality. There will be those of us who will do all of those things. But it's not a catch-up, and it's not a line.
What worries me, because I don't know how many people will look at it that way and say, this is my own, this is my life. I have to make my choices.
Sure.
And I think a lot of, India places a huge importance on the family, the concept of the family. I know, I've grown up in a very large, very opinionated, very strong family. And it's always, I think it's, on one level, it's harsh to say I'm going to abandon my family altogether, but I think it's tougher to say I'm going to really try very hard to work through it.
Sure.
But that's what worries me, because there are people that will always then say, I say this because I have, say, my siblings or my parents will say, do you think you'll get there?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know whether that's even where I want to be. So,
but what are they really saying? What they're saying to you is there a life you can lead where we will not be fearful for you? Will there be safety in your life? Will there be love in your life? Like, will there be, the questions they're asking are actually universal questions. In the end, at some point, and, whether or not you have marriage rights, that anxiety about love, security, and thing is sort of a familial attribute, right? And I think the thing about is to go back to those primary questions. What we want is to live a life where we can determine the terms by which we choose different kinds of love, different kinds of support, different kinds of intimacy. It's not to reject that love is important. It's not to reject that relationships are important. A critique of marriage is not a critique of love. And that's very important. And I think the answer back is to say, I want the same things you want, but let's both be open to the fact that they may look like what neither of us expected them to look like when we started out. And my parents have gone through that journey, right? But it's interesting, my parents have gone through that journey with me and my sister, right? Because my sister got divorced, and then suddenly it was a whole question of saying, and so both me and my sister are asking questions of saying, what does it mean to be with someone? What does it mean to belong? What does it mean to grow old? What does it mean to have love? What does it mean? And so, and it's funny, you get a divorce in the family, and suddenly the ease of marriage just goes, and not in a really good way, you know what I mean? So suddenly everyone is open to this realm of possibilities. Everyone is open to then you could do this and do that. And then my dad the other day said, what if you had 3 6-year relationships? That adds up to 18. That's pretty good. That's a lot of security and safety. You know what I mean? So everyone's kind of open to experimentation because the default has been taken aside. I think that's, to me, the important of marriage. If it's not a default, it's not going to feel as threatening even if some people choose it, and people will choose it. My fear in India is that we will go from zero to gay marriage incredibly quickly. Why? Because you will win in the Supreme Court, and then your mothers will tell you, if you're going to have a boyfriend, you better get married, because premarital sex is bad, whether it's gay or straight. And they're going to then have, Bharat Matrimony will instantly launch, right? Because there'll be a whole market to hit. No, and then as it is, the wedding industry runs on queer people. It will therefore just expand, and then, so, it will come, because if marriage is the only legitimate form of desire and sexuality, the minute gay people reach acceptability, the only acceptability they will have is marriage, and we'll have exactly the same critique. And then people will say, "Ay hai, bechari, 29 saal ki lesbian ki shaadi nahi hui, ladki nahi mili, ye nahi ho raha." It'll be and it's coming already. Now, why don't you find someone? Why don't you? My fear is entirely that we will look far too quickly, like every kind of thing. And then in my head, I'm like, that may not be the worst thing. It's also like my thing, right? It may not be the worst thing. People are happily married, running around bored on a Sunday afternoon. Like, it sounds like most people Arvind deeply aspires to Sunday afternoon boredom. With a cup of tea and a newspaper in certain countries in the globe that we shall not name. Last one, then we should close. Huh?
So when we are talking about marriage, the question is also the sense of security.
Yeah.
Just looking at religion, this whole movie coming out, Love Jihad, whether it is associated now with Muzaffarnagar, but that's a different thing. But the sense of security on the different levels, whether it's, and looking at from being an alternative sexuality to being the mainstream, and we are just like one. And for me, it's just like, how do you sort of find your space in the system where you are neither where you're institutionalizing marriage and coming from a different system where there's a constant question, when are you getting married and getting into that system? And then there's also a religious notion attached to it. Then there are state welfare schemes attached to it around the marriage, and that's where one of the victories of US were associated, that at least we'll get state welfare schemes under
You'll
certain
get taxes
systems.
and rights and loans.
Yeah.
It's not-
So how do you so when you have to bring a broader coalition, and that connects to the previous question, when you have these larger questions and there are these vested interests, how that as a person who has been negotiating this, probably I'm asking more of a reflective question. How do you deal with such situations?
Mario,
Is it
Mario.
also important, I would say, to just recognize the importance that a single narrative cannot embody everybody's experience? I mean, I think of these things, so I think of marriage, just marriage historically, and I think of family historically, and family in the 18th century is not what family is today, and family in the 19th century and marriage in the 19th century is not what family is, or marriage is today. And I think about what we think about as in terms of institutions. When we use that word, we have a certain kind of certitude around what it involves, right? A certitude about a normative way in which that relationship exists in our society. And I'm really, I think about, again, in our day and time, and historically, people who have chosen, who choose not to be in a marriage. Who are these people? These people are hijras, very often. They choose to forego the privileges of caste because they leave their families behind. They choose to forego the privileges of their biological families, inheriting money, inheriting all sorts of things. They choose to forego the privileges of marriage. And very often, today, they try to, a lot of hijras try to have relationships with men. Very often, they're not successful. But historically, you have hijras and fakirs and sadhus as people who've always been outside the norm of marriage. So for me, it's important to then question, this idea of security. If you leave marriage behind, if you leave caste behind, if you leave the traditional family behind, what you left with, you still have to have some kind of network, some kind of, somebody to hold your back. And then what you end up having very often is equally hierarchical, set of relationships that nobody really thinks of. When we think about quitting marriage, we don't think about this, right? So I think it's important to think about the diversity of narratives. I think I do agree that there is an awful lot of legitimate violence that happens within the way marriage is structured today. But I also think it's important to just think about other ways of being, which people constantly do create for each other, for themselves. I don't think just because you are in a marriage, you lose agency immediately. I don't think that just because the kind of relationships you build for yourself is called a family, you lose all of agency immediately. I don't think that's it. I think we have to think about diversity of people's lives and people's lives. And while things I'm aware of the fact that I'm a man, and I have certain privileges also, and I can say certain things without having faced a certain kind of violence in my own life. And maybe, other people who don't have that privilege experience with me. But I think it's still important to think about diversity. And one of the ways, I used to teach in the US, and one of the ways I taught in a state college, and in the US in state colleges, you have military personnel who are in your class in uniform, because the way they can attend college is because the army has paid for their education. And when Jonas Kuntell was still on the book, I constantly thought about my students who were moving to personalities. And I wondered how many of them were gay. And I wondered why Jonas Kuntell was a gay rights issue and not a labor rights issue. Because if they got thrown out, they wouldn't have these benefits. These benefits are how we live our lives also. They are the support networks that we require. So I think it's important to fight the state and still say that you have to open up the categories. You have to open up ways of being. You have to be open to different forms and different forms of support networks. And marriage shouldn't be doing that. But a lot of people still want that. But the flip side of what you were talking about with the Calcutta lesbian, the Bengali lesbian couple, is that the fact that they tied their saris together, that
and in many historical times would be marriage. It would be the equivalent of marriage.
It's how people understand the right of marriage.
Yeah.
So how do you have a critique of marriage and at the same time not judge, what actually are a lot of choices given very circumstances. I think that's the queer politics I like.
And I would say, I think, what is the ethical imperative to us as individuals? Right? I think the imperative you have is to challenge yourself. Right? The imperative is for you to not rest on the easy normative assumptions of what is handed to you. I mean, individually, that is the only ethical claim you can make upon a person. And that is the only ethical claim you can make upon yourself as a political person. Right? Beyond that, you have to respect and forgive your own humanity. I think part of what we also do to ourselves is we search for these positions of pure politics. We search for these positions of purity and belief. They don't exist. They can't exist. If they existed, they would be fascist. I mean, because the only way that purity can exist is through a violence where you ignore the complexity and reality of human life. And so I think that what I have just because you asked a reflexive question, for me personally, what I have tried to really do is just use the political life that I inherited from people who taught me politics to keep a certain ethical reflexivity in my life, to ask myself what my ethical understanding of my belief is, and whether I have that belief because I came to it on my own, or whether I am either being radical because I think it will be approved by people whose approval I seek, or being right-wing. There are plenty of people who hold very progressive beliefs for exactly the wrong reasons people hold non-progressive beliefs. Like radicalitis is as bad as right-wing politics, and there is a way in which there is a way in which I think what we owe to ourselves is to constantly keep the questions of critique and construction together, because you can't tear something down without building something else. And I think that's where my struggle with marriage is, right? I can tear it down, and then what? And then what stands? And so I think that the ethical challenge in a lot of ways is to really think about, Mario once said something to me that has always stuck in my head, which is, what is the ethical responsibility of critique? And he said it has to have two things. It has to have rigor, and it has to have empathy. Because without rigor and empathy, it is critique for the sake of criticism, of destruction, not critique for the sake of understanding and to move forward. And I think that if you seek that notion of critique, and if you hold on to rigor and empathy, then you will find a political and ethical life that makes sense for you. And that's actually the most that itna hi milta hai. I really should close, huh? But yeah, sure. Sure.
Agency, as he acknowledged, is a privilege and it doesn't exist. And marriage is, no matter how much we speak about its diversity and all, a lot of it is theory. It is institutionalized in a particular way, and it is very important to recognize that. And more we endorse that. This is the difference that has to be made. Marriage and its immense.
But let me ask you a question. So is caste. So will you ask Dalits not to take reservation and reserve seats in colleges?
Huh?
So is caste. And it's institutionalized through reservation. So does it mean we put the burden on not taking reserved seats on Dalits?
No, no, no. Marriage works in a very different way. It doesn't
But
work
in some ways,
it's like,
institutionalization of identity, caste
Yeah.
does exactly the same thing. And many people argue by accepting reservation, we institutionalize caste. By counting it in the census, we institutionalize it. By taking a caste reserved seat, you reproduce the system.
Yeah.
But can the burden of not reproducing in the system fall upon precisely those who are most vulnerable within it? I'm just saying that just to add to the complexity of what you're saying, I'm not disagreeing with you. Your argument is very
And also,
valid.
I find that is probably one reason we haven't been able to build better alternatives, because we are
That's
too
probably
much invested in it. It's too much of investment. And
Could well be.
if we do not take ourselves out of it, it's even not possible to visualize something else. So the more and more we are embedded in it, and it's impossible.
that.
What is the alternative we have? We haven't thought about it seriously. Everything that is not family, that is not marriage, that is not spouse, those relationships are not visible precisely because we are too much invested in this.
That's possible.
So
Yeah. Could you close this in?
Any other last comment?
Pradeep?
So, thank you to IIHS again for initiating this fantastic series. I wish I lived in Bangalore. I would love to come to many more of these, but it was a privilege to be here and to speak to both friends and to catch up with Arvind, who I haven't seen in years. Hold this conversation. So thank you. Thank you to both of you, and thank you to IIHS.
Thank you so much, Madhu and Arvind, Gautam, for being here and initiating the discussion on this. And it's really wonderful, many people have come together and raised their voices and be a part of it. Thank you so much. And the introduction in this to tell about PublicTexts. PublicTexts will be a part of a series, and where the artists talk about their work and will throw light on the issues about the present, and it should be dynamic and free-ranging issues for so it could be comprehensive of different areas, and it could include seminars, events, and exhibitions and others. Please do join us in future, and we have a sign up there. If you want to be notified in future, please join us. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Can I just quickly thank Pradeep, because for learning institutions like Narrain are the heart and soul of what he is building, and he keeps insisting it's not, but Publics and PublicTexts are all his ideas, and he claims that as IHS library events, some institutional events. So he's constantly pushing us to do things and bring people